Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Wash, your trusted resource for the latest in public health and hygiene. This podcast is brought to you by Meritech, the leader in automated hygiene technology, and was created in collaboration with Protect, a specialty glove supplier and leader in glove-related research. I'm your host today, Joe Johnson, and I'm joined by Paul Barnhill, the Chief Technology Officer and Head Engineer here at Meritech, and Steve Ardagh, founder of Protect. Thanks for joining us, Paul and Steve. Today we're going to talk about gloves. There's quite a bit of misinformation out there, so we hope to debunk those myths and provide some clarity around the subject.
So Steve, before we get started, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and Protect.
Yeah, sure. As long as you've got 30 or 40 minutes, that's fine. We love telling our stories, so thanks for the opportunity, Joe and Meritech. We started in New Zealand in 2006, servicing the food industry there with disposable gloves and clothing. And New Zealand's seen as one of the leaders in food safety around the world. So it was a good stamping ground to sort of learn our trade. We moved to the States in 2016. And our vision here is literally to save the US food industry one glove at a time. We found in many cases they're using products that are probably not best suited for the areas they're using them. There's not a lot of help from the industry in terms of food safety and proper process. So that was us. And so we've been growing ever since. And we've got some great customers here in the likes of Costco and JBS Meats, Cargill Meats, and all those sort of guys. So we're really enjoying our time here, and obviously just at the moment glove and hand hygiene is a very big focus for everybody.
Great, thanks for that intro, Steve. So I think the best way to start this conversation is to discuss glove use cases. What industries are gloving right now, and what industries do you think maybe need to focus more on gloving?
Yeah, it's sort of everybody's pretty well gloving at the moment, I guess, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit more later. But I mean, there's three main industries that we look into, if you like. There's medical, food, and industrial in terms of gloves. Medical is obvious, so there's the surgical sterile gloves, which we don't operate in. Medical examination grade gloves, which we service in New Zealand into dental and medical centres, aged care, and food. In New Zealand and the US is a huge user, right from retail, ready to eat, food processing, primary food processing in the form of dairy, meat, seafood, and so on. And then industrial, which is basically everything else, from your engineers, probably to the guys who are making your machines, and these sort of guys wearing various types of gloves. And there's a myriad of gloves. I mean, there's millions of them. I guess one of the things based on that, sort of those three, medical, food, and industrial, there's only one area there that has a certification, a real certification, that's medical. There's no such thing as a food grade glove. It's something that's been made up by the industry. There is a food compliance by the FDA, which we can talk about in more detail, but there's really just medical and other in terms of the types of gloves that are being used. All our gloves are examination grade gloves, because we believe that gloves that are used to prevent foodborne illness should be the same quality and standard as the gloves that were treated. So we just go for the medical grade gloves for the food industry.
So do you expect, aside from those main three, do you expect other industries to continue with their adoption of gloving because of the pandemic?
Yeah, definitely. We've had requests from everyone you can imagine at the moment in terms of glove use. Retail is going to be a big area, not just food retail, but retail of almost anything. Anywhere where people are coming in contact with each other or surfaces. But I guess as people sort of get to know the pandemic a little bit in more detail, are deciding whether it's more surface orientated or aerosol orientated, and that may change the usage patterns. But we're getting calls from everybody from aged care through to clothing retail, obviously food, cleaners, just all sorts of people, anyone who comes into contact with any outside surface or other people, I guess, really. So, and it's interesting because one of the challenges we have is, and it's the medical industry as well, are suffering from this, that like with the masks, is that we don't want people who don't need really good nitrile gloves, for example, using up the stock that should be being used by food industry or medical. And so there's a few challenges around inventory and supply, and we're sort of trying to work our way through that by offering different choices for different situations.
So in these industries that are gloving, what are the most common mistakes that are typically being made in that process?
Traditionally, the biggest mistake, or maybe mistake's probably a too strong a word, but the biggest thing that's overlooked is glove choice. Often people just think a glove's a glove, and anything will do, and it's not true. It's a technical tool of trade. If you ask someone who works in a meat processing plant who wears a glove for 8 hours a day, they'll tell the difference between a good and a bad glove instantly. Same with retail. So we just help people, for example, choose, depending on the situation, how long they're going to use it, what sort of process they're undertaking. Is it heavy work, light work? Does it need a real tactile sensitivity, that sort of thing? We help them choose the best glove. And then there's the typical things, putting gloves on. Often, if it's not done properly, they can contaminate the glove with their dirty hands if they're not washed properly, or if they're touching surfaces. Some people will carry around gloves in their pockets and then put them on when they're needed, which is obviously bad. People often use gloves too long. Any glove at all will degrade over time, just like anything that's been used and flexed. So there's lots of those sort of things. And then taking the gloves off is another big one, that you can contaminate your hands again as you take the glove off and potentially contaminate surfaces or the next glove. They're the main areas.
So we talked about this briefly, but I've been seeing a lot of people wearing gloves during regular day-to-day activities in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I saw someone recently in the park eating out of a bag of chips with a pair of gloves on. So Paul, I was wondering if you could clarify for people that their gloved hands can still become contaminated, just like hands without gloves, correct?
You're absolutely correct, Joe. And I think Steve was very clear in kind of a couple points that he made. Yes, a glove can be contaminated just from the same touch surfaces. It can be contaminated both during the donning and doffing periods. So yeah, a glove can be. I mean, yeah, you see those individuals with the current situations that were going on around the world, using gloves, using them too long, as Steve had mentioned, reusing gloves, which is a really terrible practice, regardless what you're in. You can also sanitize a glove. I mean, that's a very easy process, and that's actually not a very uncommon process that you see in food manufacturing industry. So that is very common. You'll see it in other places as well, that them sanitizing glove after donning that glove.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on sanitizing gloves? Is there any things people need to be aware of in terms of the chemicals that's used in sanitizers associated with certain types of gloves?
Absolutely. There are certain glove materials that can actually degrade in time, depending on overuse of certain type of chemicals. Certain high concentrations of quat sanitizers can sometimes break down certain rubbers and plastics as well. A lot of times people are using, when they're sanitizing a glove, they're actually using some form of an alcohol or an IPA product that's really effective. It's efficient at cleaning the glove. It will dry quickly, so forth, as well as other ways you can. We do have in our industry at Meritech, we have many customers, after they've gone through that donning part of the glove, they'll actually go back through the clean tech systems and use the automated hand washing systems to actually further sanitize that glove in an automated process. So depends on kind of what that industry is and how is that glove being used, because there's lots of different ways you can use a glove and a lot of different needs depending on what your people, place, and products are being dealt with.
So Paul, this is a question that's asked often, but does gloving remove the need for hand washing?
The answer is no. You really have to start with a clean hand, and that's really important. So, in time and in use, and gloves will break down. When you don a glove, it now becomes a little bit of a warm, moist environment. And this is really just a breeding ground for additional pathogens. So by doing a proper hand hygiene event, we're able to naturally lower both the resident and transient floors on the hand, keeping the hand clean. And doing that process before donning gloves is incredibly important. In fact, not only just washing the hands before it, but there's a critical step in there as well, and that's in the drying portion of it. One of the things that we get asked a lot is like, oh yeah, we're going to go through this step and we're going to wash and now we're going to dry and we're going to use this air dryer. And I highly recommend not using air dryers when you have to go into a gloving operation, because you're unfortunately not able to get the hand dry enough, and then it becomes a very difficult time donning a glove if your hand is somewhat moist.
Mm-hmm. It's mentioned on y'all's website. I was doing a little reading, and there was a blog article that was talking about how gloves act as a liquid bridge for pathogens when they're not properly washed prior to donning gloves. Could you elaborate more on what that liquid bridge is?
Yeah, it's one of our favourite subjects. We've got a great photo of a guy preparing a hamburger, and he's just putting in the piece of stick in the top to hold it all together, and he's got this dripping, sweating hand. And it's just it's a wonderful picture. We talk about the liquid bridge or the glove juice, and then so the person's wearing the glove, and often the poorer quality gloves will create more sweat and moisture than other gloves, particularly vinyl PVC gloves. And then you get a rip or a tear, and we have this beautiful vomit of glove juice that goes all over the food. So it's just a real risk, and it's apart from anything else, it's just not attractive to look at, but it's just a real food safety. And there's lots of ways of sort of getting around that. One is not using the gloves too long, making sure you're using the right glove. And a comment we get often is when we give people our gloves, and because they've been made from a really good material and they're not aggravating the skin, they just don't sweat as much. So I think getting the right good quality glove makes a huge difference as well to that glove juice problem.
Mm-hmm. With the need for hand washing prior to gloving, what's the best way to organize your hygiene zone to avoid cross-contamination when you're gloving?
That's actually a really, really good question. And one of the first things you have to really understand when it comes to hygienic zoning, you really have to follow what we call the 3 Ps, the people, the place, and the products. You really have to understand that to fully understand the entire picture of hygiene and how you design that hygienic zoning. You know, we'll call it from the 10,000 foot level of what you're looking at is, and obviously when you're first coming in, you want to be donning, you know, your frock and smocks or whatever you're doing for your outerwear. Obviously, the beginning of that, you'll deal with your footwear, hair nets, and your normal PPE. You go then through the hand hygiene event, and that's either going to be in a manual traditional method, following those guidelines, or in our case, doing a fully automated hand washing system to fully wash and sanitize that hands in a very quickly, consistent manner every time. Once you get done with that hand washing, it's really important to then, I highly recommend going through a paper towel product dry to then go on to that gloving zone. And then that gloving zone is really, really important. I mean, gloves need to be to where they fit properly. They're not loose fitting, they're not overly tight, they're comfortable. The glove of choice has been designed for whatever you're coming in contact with, you know, and what is it you're dealing with. Just an additional note on there, another thing to look at is when you're using gloves within maybe an RTE or a raw area, obviously, you know, good separation, good hygiene intervention steps there, but you also may run into allergens too. You could potentially get an allergen on a glove, and you can't sanitize that away. You actually have to wash that away. So there could be a possibly cross-contamination risk. So you have to look at that when it comes to your hygienic zoning. That's why it's so important to understand that people, place, and products, so that you make sure that you look at all those risk factors when it comes to hygienic zoning, and the use of gloves in those zones.
Great, thanks, Paul. So Steve, I've read some about the issues that gloves can cause with skin health. So what kind of troubles can people run into with that, and what are some options for people with sensitive skin who have to wear gloves regularly?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of misinformation in a way out there about things. I mean, latex gloves initially were a problem that in many states have now stopped people wearing latex gloves with food because of the potential to carry across the proteins on the gloves which cause allergies. So latex gloves can affect skin, particularly people with susceptibility to other allergies as well. It seems to run in the family, if you like. And then some of the nitrile gloves that we sell people have different accelerators in it. And I guess each glove's like a recipe, if you like. And when the glove manufacturer makes a glove, for example, for someone in a dental clinic, it's a totally different recipe to someone who's going to be handling a large piece of meat and cutting it into chops, for example. And so there's a number of different accelerators, some of which can be quite, if not done properly, can be quite damaging to skin, sensitive skins. And so there's a number of options there that you've got to be aware of as well. And that's where it goes back to the glove choice. What's the glove we need for the job that has to be done? In terms of people who are really sensitive to some of these accelerators, we have an accelerator-free option, and most companies will have some sort of accelerator-free option these days. And they tend to be a little bit more expensive, but they take out some of these chemicals that can cause sensitivities to some people's skin. But it is, I mean, these people, people who are using these gloves as a tool of trade in ready-to-eat places, food processing, meat processing, I mean, it's on their hands for 8 hours a day. So it's really important to get a good quality glove. And it goes right back to the factories where these are made, the raw materials they've been made from. And it's one of the reasons we've initiated a 5-step check, which checks what the raw materials are in each glove. If there's any dermal toxicity, we use a number of tests to check the toxicity of the surface of the glove to the skin, and then a number of other characteristics that we can check for to make sure that people are going to have a good experience with the glove. Because it's just like everything else. It's like a carpenter and a hammer. A person's glove is his tool of trade, and we need to make it as easy and as efficient to use as possible.
Hey, Steve, just a real quick question in regards to the gloves and looking at them. When you guys manufacture your gloves, do you actually look at them for, not obviously sterility, because that's a different type of gloving, but do you look at them as being able to control pathogens, meaning that are out of the box and so forth?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's another one of our favorite. We've done a lot of work on this and over the years, and we're starting to publish some of the trial results now. We've been working with a microbiologist called Barry Michaels, who's well known in the glove and hand industry. He's sort of known as a glove hand guru. We've done a lot of checks on the gloves, and it's interesting results. We've without going into too much detail, that we checked in putting together our testing system. We checked 25 different brands of gloves coming into the US, medical and for medical use and food use. And I think last count, we found about 180 different pathogens on the gloves, from E. coli and other foodborne illness pathogens to food waste pathogens, food spoilage pathogens, so that people could be handling, for example, in a supermarket, they might be stacking apples and they're actually adding the potential for that food to spoil faster. And the things like E. coli and other pathogens that could pass on foodborne illness onto food and then onto the consumer. And these are on new gloves that are straight out of the box after arriving into the US. And one of the things I guess people don't realize is that there's no checks on gloves when they arrive into the US for what are called food grade gloves. There's an FDA compliance, and that is a fairly complicated compliance that gloves have to meet, which is based around the chemicals that are in the glove and their potential to migrate out of the glove into the food. But there's no requirement for a glove to be clean. There's no requirement for a glove to not have holes or breakages in it. And there's no requirement for them not to have other materials on, which we've found, like feces, sewage, mold, fungus, and so on. So it is one of those areas that we're trying to raise awareness that just because a glove's in a box, it doesn't mean it's clean. So you may actually be preloading your business, your food processing plant with pathogens by buying either poor quality or not very well made gloves. And it all goes, to your point, Paul, it all goes back to the factories where there's either poor filtration systems for the water that cleans the gloves as part of the process, or there's some sort of other contamination within the factory that's causing the problem. And one of the things that the meat processing industry in New Zealand does now, which is not totally efficient, but helps, is when they put on a glove in the line, they then wash them with really hot water, which is part of the process because they're washing their knives all the time as well. So it just gives them that little extra step. It's obviously not as a full clean, but it just wipes off any debris that may be on the gloves.
Interesting. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty scary, I'd say, what is allowed and what's not. And I guess the thing that really worries me the most is the perception that people have that a glove's clean just because it comes out of a box. And they're not sterile, so we don't pretend that they're supposed to be sterile, but we do want them to be clean. And as I say, part of the testing process for us is we do this on our lots as they come into the country, and we can sort of validate that our gloves are as clean as they possibly can be without being sterile.
One of the things that I've noticed over almost the last 3 decades in the food manufacturing business and in the hygiene business, it really a lot of times boils down to really the behaviors. When a person dons a set of gloves, they actually take on this different persona that I'm more protected, and they seem to touch things more often. One of those being their faces, so forth and so on. So it is still the awareness that you have a glove on. The glove can be, a protection for me, but it can be a protection for someone else. And it gets in that area, but it really still boils down to that human hygiene behavior of, yeah, I'm wearing a glove, but I still need to follow those proper hygiene steps and measures. And that all comes from them creating really a hygiene culture and people understanding those risk factors. And that really falls on the C staff and the leaders and the team member leaders and the middle management to really enforce that and make that clear for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had some, and I won't mention names, but we've had a couple of customers, and I've seen their food, because their previous gloves to ours were ripping so much, the workers would put gloves in their pockets, and when the glove ripped, rather than having to go back to the booth and wash their hands, put on new gloves, they'd just take them out of the pocket, put them on, and then carry on with their preparation of ready-to-eat food. And that's obviously an absolute no-no. And I said to them, that's not a really good process. And they said, oh, we've got a good process, but they just don't follow it. And I said, but you've probably got a process for locking the door at night as well. Are they allowed to not follow that? And so it's really the enforcement of the process and trying to get people to understand that this isn't voluntary. It's an essential part of keeping the business clean and not literally making people sick. And I think the other big thing that people do is, particularly with some of the lighter gloves like the CPE and the PE gloves, they use them too long. They should be used for literally minutes because they'll break down really quickly. And they're fine for some jobs. If you're making a quick sandwich, a PE glove's probably a good choice. But if you use it for 5 sandwiches, then you're starting to run into problems. So it is a real culture thing. And I know there's been a lot of work done and being done by the FDA and others to try and instill that into industry. And I think if there's a positive out of all this mess that we're in at the moment, it's the focus on hand and glove hygiene that I think will carry on after this is hopefully finished.
Yeah, very insightful. Very, very insightful.
So, Steve, we talked briefly about some of the issues that you can run into with subpar glove manufacturing. So, what are some things to look for in a glove supplier, and how can someone ensure the gloves they're buying are safe and effective?
Yeah, it's tricky actually, and there's a lot of trading of gloves going on at the moment, and I got a message about 5 minutes before we started here from a guy saying, my manufacturer sent me a certificate. How do I know if it's genuine? And it's a really good question, because often the certificate is from a lab 3 doors down from the factory, and you just don't quite know what's going on. I mean, one of the things we do, I've personally visited every factory we use on many occasions. We use an organisation called Child Labour Free to certify and audit the factories regularly. We're using other organisations like SEDEX, which is another auditing facility. So we know that the factories are well looked after. The industry is rife with poor labour practices. throughout Southeast Asia. In fact, one manufacturer was banned from entering the US late last year because of labour rights violations. So there's all these things, and I guess they're sort of like the canary in the coal mine type of thing. If they're not treating their workers right, how are they working in their factory? How is the filtration system? How's the water quality, and so on? So these are all those sort of things are important. So I guess it's really doing a bit of research. I imagine when people come to buy the Meritech machine, that they do a lot of research and they look at your documentation and they make sure it works. And it's no different really for a glove. As simple as it may seem, they should be doing the same sort of due diligence on the glove and the manufacturer, and asking good questions, which we're trying to assist in terms of helping people know what to ask. But yeah, it's a bit of a minefield. But I think it's the fact that we visit the factories so we know what goes on. For good or bad, I've been in the industry now for about 16 or 17 years, and I've seen some pretty interesting stuff. In fact, the very first factory I went to, which I won't name the country because I don't want to start an international incident, but they took us to the packing room, which is a room where gloves are typically just on a table and there's people counting them out into 25s. They put 4 25s in a bundle and then put them in a box. And this was a room that stunk of acid and chlorine. It was dirty on a concrete floor with no walls. It was just a roof because it was a hot part of the world. And one person's job was to go around these piles of gloves and wipe off the cockroaches and the flies. And then they put them into box. And I noticed at the time, and this was unfortunately pre-iPhone, so I couldn't take a photo or anything. But I noticed at the time they were medical examination gloves destined for the US on the branding. So it's, people just assume that these factories, and to be fair now, I should say that the factories have improved a lot. I haven't seen anything like that for a long time. But I think it's just being aware of what can happen and doing some due diligence on your supplier.
Steve, we've talked about a few different types of gloves, and I was wondering if you could just give us a high-level overview of the most common glove types and their advantages or disadvantages of each.
Yep. So latex gloves we talked about briefly, and they're not for the food industry. They're not really a choice these days because of basically the regulations say you can't handle food with them in many cases, but they are probably the best possible glove you could buy in terms of fit and environmental. It's basically a natural product. Unfortunately, as I say, the food industry can't use them, but you'll find them well used in medical centres, particularly still in surgery. That'd be the glove of choice for anybody in a sterile situation. At the very other end of the scale is vinyl PVC gloves. These are horrible, but we've stopped selling them several years ago. They were banned in several countries from 2001 for use with food contact because of the chemicals they contain. And there's a lot of science on PVC. Vinyl gloves are made from PVC. And the way they're made, so PVC is a hard, solid. People might recognize PVC pipe. It's obviously hard. To make that malleable and to be able to made into a glove, there's a lot of plasticizers added. Some are phthalates, which have been known to cause all sorts of cancers and so on. Now, a lot of vinyl gloves don't have those in, but some do. And it's really hard, again, to know which is which. The other thing is there were trials done in the late 1900s and the early 2000s by the medical industry on vinyl gloves. And they found on average 52% of gloves have holes in them immediately after donning because of the molecular structure. It was a linear molecular structure. So you put the glove on, it splits apart, then you've got holes that will let a virus and a bacteria through. So the medical industry basically stopped using them for that reason and other reasons. But the food industry, particularly in the US, uses them a lot, particularly in ready-to-eat supermarkets, fast food, those sort of areas. And the only real reason to use them is they're cheap. There's no other reason. They're not comfortable. They sweat a lot. So you can probably tell I'm not a keen fan of vinyl gloves. And then there's nitrile gloves, which, there's as many gloves as you can think of within the nitrile range. They've got some good chemical resistance. The sensitive glove I mentioned earlier that's got accelerated free is also chemotherapy rated. So it means that, if you're using chemicals of various sorts, even in a food or a cleaning sense, they're a good choice. They're also really comfortable. They're as close to a latex sort of tactile and sensitivity as you can get from a synthetic product. And they're coming down in price. Well, they were prior to this, but they're coming down in price as usage increases around the world. They were known to be pretty expensive, but now they're pretty cost effective. And we showed with one major customer that by shifting from a vinyl to a nitrile glove, even though they were paying more per glove, they were saving money per month by the less wastage, less rips, and so on. And a higher productivity too, which is hard to measure, but when you've got a good fitting glove, people can be more productive, particularly with tactile work like ready to eat and so on. The other option we're looking at as well is a range of loosely fitting gloves, and they're either polyethylene, chlorinated polyethylene, or a new one, a relatively new one called TPE. And they are quite a good fit for some areas, particularly really quick jobs, like again making a sandwich, or if you're in a supermarket cutting ham or something, you can use that for 2 to 3 minutes and then dispose of it. So it's areas where you don't really need a good glove, but a good long-lasting glove, but you do need still a good barrier for a short period of time. The trick is to not use them for too long and get into bad habits that way.
Could you speak to the environmental impacts of the different gloving materials and their manufacturing processes?
So, and it's where gloves started, 40, 50 years ago, really. And so they basically take the sap from a rubber tree and make everything from tires to disposable gloves out of it. And that's why even gloves that are made from petrochemical products like vinyl and nitrile are still in the areas that tend to have rubber trees, because that's where the infrastructure was set up. Really, you could make nitrile gloves anywhere because the raw material comes out of the ground in the forms of petrochemical product. But certainly, vinyl gloves, we know that vinyl produces dioxin when it's been manufactured, and when the gloves are disposed of, it also leaches dioxin as well. So either via a landfill or if it's burnt, incinerated. So we just don't like them at all. Latex gloves are relatively natural, depending on how they're made and what other ingredients are in them, but you can't use them for the food industry. Nitrile, again, has a range of ingredients depending on the type of glove. We'd love to say they're recyclable and reusable or compostable, but really there's no viable way of doing that yet. So the best thing is to reduce. The sort of zero waste hierarchy starts with reduce. So again, to use the example, we moved one major customer from a vinyl glove that weighed 4.8 grams to a nitrile glove that weighed 2.8 grams. So straight away, for the same number of gloves, they're saving significant amount of raw material, and the gloves last longer and don't rip as much, and there's various other benefits as well. And that translates right through to the transportation. If you consider they're shipped halfway around the world, if you can ship less gloves, you're basically using less carbon and so on. So it's sort of a win-win right back. But the goal is eventually to work out ways of reusing or recycling these gloves in some way, or repurposing them, which is a lot of work being done on, but it's just not quite viable as yet when you've got a potentially contaminated product coming out of the food or the medical site, and people don't want to use a second-hand glove, in those sort of situations. So there's a few challenges, but there's a lot of work being done on it.
So how do you advise handling the disposal of these gloves?
Well, it starts with a good doffing process, which we've got a good video, and there's several good, in fact, CDC just put out a good example of how to do that. So making sure you're not contaminating yourself as you're taking them off. And then really the only option, as I say at the moment, is to go to landfill or incineration, depending on what the local situation is. The PE and the TPE gloves and CPE gloves, they can be recycled with normal plastic. So they can literally go in your plastic recycling bin. The potential problem is if they're contaminated with anything, food product, then they need to be washed and cleaned before they can be done with that. But that's one of the challenges that us and various others are working on in terms of how do we help people discard less, and the start is use less. So our focus is on getting people to use less of a better product.
All right, Paul, we mentioned earlier briefly about how compliance is a pretty big issue when it comes to gloving. So could you offer some tips on how to improve compliance and further develop a culture where gloving is a priority?
Well, I think you just mentioned it right there. I think the number one thing you have to really start with is creating that hygiene culture. And obviously you start with that, with your hygiene social contract. And that's really, really important. But one of the things that you can interlace within your compliance structure is proper training videos, making sure that you're training people in the right languages they understand, showing videos and posters that really demonstrate the proper use. Other ways that you can do that, depending on, again, your people, place, and products, you can have gloves that may have different colors, depending on kind of, these gloves are used in an allergen area, these gloves are used in a raw area, these gloves are used in an RTE setting. This helps you create that standard. I mean, within consistency, you can build quality. And so you really take those steps and look at that, exactly what that use model is of that glove. So you can really identify, what are your pitfalls of compliance? How do you make certain that people are wearing the glove properly? Are you seeing people and staff reusing a glove when they shouldn't be, or they trying to re-sanitize that glove? Or you may have a line worker and team member that is working a couple different lines. They may be going from one side to another side. Does there need to be an intervention step between those two processes so that there's not a risk of cross-contamination? That's the bigger thing. And then also just that constant reassurance, that constant onboarding with staff to make sure that they're meeting the requirements of that facility. Are you understanding exactly and following the procedures that are established, not only for, meeting any regulatory requirements, but also meeting what, again, back to creating that hygiene culture and understanding, this is how we want to establish those compliance guidelines. There's nothing worse in my mind when wearing a glove, when a glove doesn't fit properly. That's where you have some risk factors. Being able to provide gloves that fit your various people, obviously, hands come in all different sizes. And so we need to make sure to have that. But obviously having all those key hygiene steps is the best thing when it comes to creating the best compliance structures.
The colours thing is a really good point, and people use that for allergen control as well, to make sure that there's no cross contamination. It's really just a focus. Gloves are a key Zone 1 item, so they're as important as any other Zone 1 food safety item in your processing plant. And to me, when I walk in, I've used the term before today, but when I walk into a processing plant or a retail plant, the gloves are the canary in the coal mine. Frontline workers have been given a poor tool of trade, a cheap tool of trade that's not doing the job for them. And I've seen, to Paul's point, I've seen companies that just provide a medium-sized glove for everybody because it's cheaper. Those sort of things. Then straight away that there's going to be some bad process back behind the scenes as well. So it's a real canary in the coal mine. It's a really interesting area, which focus now is coming on the hand glove hygiene, which is music to our ears.
I want to thank both Paul and Steve for their insightful commentary on the topic of gloving. Meritech and Eagle Protect have a mutual passion for making the world a healthier and safer place. That is why our organizations have decided to partner on educational content like this podcast. To further support this information, we have co-authored an ebook, Gloving 101. To learn more about gloving and to download this ebook, please visit the link in the description, meritech.com or eagleprotect.com.